Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Human AI podcast. Today we're going to talk about the anterior abdominal wall and the inguinal canal. If you're unfamiliar with how the show goes, I ask questions to AI about topics such as these, which I'm very unfamiliar with. AI enlightens us. Take everything that it says with a pinch of salt, it might do mistakes. Having said that, I hope you find this video informative and enjoyable. Let's start, Grok. Give us a good introduction on the anterior abdominal wall and the inguinal canal.
Yo, what's good? Thanks for tuning into the Human AI podcast. The anterior abdominal wall is the muscular, layered front of your abdomen, stretching from ribs to pelvis, protecting organs and helping with posture and movement. The inguinal canal, a short tunnel in the lower wall, lets structures like the spermatic cord in guys or the round ligament in gals pass through, but it's also a weak spot for hernias. Want to dive into the wall's layers or the canal's anatomy first?
Yeah, why don't we start with the boundaries of the abdominal cavity? So we have a superior boundary, the diaphragm, and the inferior, which is the pelvic inlet.
The abdominal cavity is bounded superiorly by the diaphragm, a dome-shaped muscle separating it from the thoracic cavity, controlling breathing and stabilizing the core. Inferiorly, the pelvic inlet, formed by the pelvic bones, marks the transition to the pelvic cavity, shaping the lower limit where abdominal organs like the intestines sit. Want to explore the lateral or anterior boundaries next?
Why
or
is
jump
it
in?
called pelvic inlet and not pelvic outlet?
The pelvic inlet is called so because it's the upper opening of the pelvis where abdominal organs enter the pelvic cavity, marking the entry point from the abdomen above. It's not called the pelvic outlet, which is the lower opening where the pelvis exits to the perineum, as the inlet specifically describes the top boundary relevant to the abdominal cavity's inferior limit. Want to dig into the pelvic inlet's role in abdominal anatomy?
No, that's okay. And what's the false pelvis? False and true pelvis. And the pelvic cavity and the abdominal cavity. Well, yeah.
All right, let's break down the true and false pelvis and how the pelvic and abdominal cavities relate. The true pelvis is the lower, bony part below the pelvic inlet, a ring formed by the sacrum, ilium, and pubis, housing pelvic organs like the bladder and rectum. The false pelvis, above the inlet and part of the abdominal cavity, is the wider, shallower area between the iliac crests, containing abdominal organs like the intestines. The abdominal cavity extends from the diaphragm to the pelvic inlet, including the false pelvis, while the pelvic cavity is just the true pelvis below the inlet. Want to connect this to the anterior abdominal wall or dive into inguinal canal anatomy?
I don't understand their differences, to be honest, of the true and the false.
No worries, let's clear it up simply. The true pelvis is the lower, narrower part of the pelvis below the pelvic inlet, a bony ring formed by the sacrum, ilium, and pubis, housing pelvic organs like the bladder and uterus. The false pelvis is the wider, upper part above the inlet, between the iliac crests, and it's actually part of the abdominal cavity, holding organs like the intestines. Want me to sketch out how this ties to the abdominal wall or inguinal canal?
Sure, so what is this false and true, dude? This is what's confusing me.
Alright, dude, let's make this crystal clear. The true pelvis is the deep, bony bowl below the pelvic inlet, the line formed by the top edges of the pelvic bones, where organs like the bladder and rectum sit, like a cozy basement for pelvic stuff. The false pelvis is the shallow, wider space above that line, between the hip bones, and it's really just part of the abdominal cavity, holding intestines and other gut organs, more like an open attic. Want to link this to the anterior
That's okay.
abdominal?
Now, let's talk about the innominate bones. How come they're called innominate? And let's talk about the iliac fossa, the ischium, and the pubis. Explain to us regarding the iliac fossa how it's broken down to anterior superior iliac spine, anterior inferior, posterior inferior, inferior and posterior superior, and explain to us iliac crest, iliac tubercle too.
All right, let's dive into the mnemonic bones and break this down. The mnemonic bones, also called hip bones or os coxae, are named mnemonic from Latin meaning nameless because their complex, irregular shape didn't neatly match a single descriptive term, unlike other bones like the femur. Each mnemonic bone is formed by three fused parts, the ilium, ischium, and pubis, which together create the pelvis and connect to the sacrum and femur. Ilium, the largest part, forming the upper, fan-shaped portion of the hip bone. The iliac fossa is the smooth, concave inner surface of the ilium, housing abdominal organs like the intestines in the false pelvis. The iliac crest is the thick, curved top edge of the ilium, where you feel your hips, serving as an attachment for abdominal and hip muscles. The iliac tubercle is a small, bumpy spot on the outer crest, a landmark for muscle and ligament attachments. Iliac fossal landmarks. The anterior superior iliac spine, ASES, is the front top bump of the ilium, easily felt under the skin and key for muscle attachments like the sartorius. The anterior inferior iliac spine, AISE, lies just below, anchoring the rectus femoris. The posterior superior iliac spine, PSIS, is the back top bump, often marked by dimples above the buttocks, connecting to ligaments and muscles. The posterior inferior iliac spine, PISA, is below it, less prominent.
Okay. What about in the pubis? We have pectineal line.
All right, let's dive into the pubis
And
and the
also,
pectineal.
how come they call pubis and ischium? Just in a couple of sentences, dude. You don't need to talk much.
The pubis, from Latin pubis, meaning groin, is named for its location at the front of the pelvis near the genital region. The ischium, from Greek ischion, meaning hip, is named for forming the lower, sturdy part you sit on. Want to dive into the pectineal line or back to the inguinal canal?
That makes sense. Okay. And what is the pelvic girdle? What's the sacrum? And talk to me about the inguinal ligament, how it's the boundary between the abdominal wall and thigh and the pubic tubercle and the coccyx too.
The pelvic girdle is the ring-like structure formed by the two mnemonic bones and the sacrum, connecting the spine to the legs and supporting the abdominal and pelvic organs. The sacrum, a triangular bone at the base of the spine, fuses with the mnemonic bones at the sacroiliac joints, stabilizing the pelvis, while the coccyx, a small tailbone below the sacrum, anchors minor muscles and ligaments. The inguinal ligament, stretching from the anterior superior iliac spine to the pubic tubercle, forms the lower boundary between the anterior abdominal wall and thigh, acting as a taut band that supports the inguinal canal. Want to dive into the inguinal ligament's role in hernias or explore the abdominal wall layers next?
Tell me more about the pelvic girdle, the sacrum, and everything I mentioned. Kind of a few words for each, really, really simply so we can understand. Come on. Hey, dude. Didn't you hear what I said? Could you tell me again, in simple words, all these things that I mentioned, all these words, so we can understand them?
Yo, dude, I got you. Let's break down the pelvic girdle, sacrum, coccyx, and inguinal ligament in super simple terms. Like we're chilling over coffee. Pelvic girdle, think of it as a bony belt made of 2 hip bones, innominate bones, and the sacrum. It holds up your guts, connects your spine to your legs, and keeps everything stable. Sacrum, this is a flat, triangle-shaped bone at the bottom of your spine, sandwiched between the 2 hip bones, acting like the pelvis's anchor to keep it solid. Coccyx, your tiny tailbone, just below the sacrum, a little nub that's mostly there for small muscle attachments. Like a leftover tail, humans don't need much. Inguinal ligament, a tough, stretchy band running from your hip's front bump, anterior superior iliac spine, to your pubic bone's tubercle, a small knob. It separates your belly from your thigh and helps form the inguinal canal, a passageway that can be a hernia hotspot. These parts work together to support your body and protect organs, with the inguinal ligament marking where your abdomen ends and thigh begins. Want to dive into how hernias happen with the inguinal canal, or zoom in on the abdominal wall next?
Why do we call in the 9 regions of the abdomen? Where did the name flank/lumbar came from?
The term 9 digits, or divisions of the abdomen, refers to the 9-region system used by anatomists and physicians to describe the abdominal area for study, diagnosis, and treatment. But it's not a standard phrase. It might be a mix-up or colloquial reference
I
to
asked
these
you
regions.
about the flank and the lumbar region.
All right, let's clarify the flank and lumbar region simply. The flank refers to the side of the abdomen between the lower ribs and the iliac crest, part of the lateral abdominal wall, often linked to organs like the kidneys. The lumbar region, named for its spinal vertebrae, L1, L5, is the lower back area, but also describes the posterior abdomen region in anatomy, overlapping with the flank and housing structures like the retroperitoneal organs. Want to connect these to the abdominal wall layers